So as discussed before, this session is going to hit the issue side. We touched on issues before in terms of within the context of regions, but these are going to look at them within the functional side of it. And of course, we'll then hear, I'm sure, some discussion in turn on the regional aspects. And so while we're getting folks mic'd up here, I'll do quick introductions. First, we'll hear from Ian Wallace, who's visiting fellow in cybersecurity at the Center for 21st Century Security Intelligence here at Brookings. He's a former senior official with the British Ministry of Defence, where he helped develop the UK's cyber strategy, as well as its cyber relationship with the US. And his research is focusing on the international dimensions of cybersecurity policy, and particularly the implications of cyber for military forces. Then we'll hear from Bruce Jones, who's director of the Project on International Order and Strategy at Brookings. His work examines U.S. international security policy, global order, international conflict management, and as you heard pitched by one of our last speakers, he's the author of a book that came out in March entitled Still Ours to Lead, America, Rising Powers and the Tensions Between Rivalry and Restraint. It's available for purchase outside, as well as for those webcasting. I think there's an e-version, Bruce? Yep. Yes, okay. And then we'll hear from Cam Carey. He's the Tisch Distinguished Visiting Fellow with the Governance Studies program at Brookings. He's also a visiting scholar with the MIT Media Lab. He's done many things in his career, but important to this topic, he was formerly General Counsel and Acting Secretary of the Department of Commerce, where he worked on a wide variety of issues important to U.S. economic growth in a global marketplace, including particularly touching on this topic, privacy, data security, intellectual property, international trade. And then finally, we'll hear from Bob Butler. He's the Vice President of Government Strategies for I/O, which is a privately held data center builder and provider. And he's also an adjunct fellow at the Center for New America Security. Relevant to this discussion, in addition to those, is he was previously the first Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Cyber Policy at the Pentagon, where he was the principal advisor to the SecDef and other DoD leaders on cyber strategy and policy. So what I'd like to do is essentially pitch each of you the same set of questions. Within your functional area, what did you see as the major impact that played out over the last year? Weigh for us the effect of the NSA leaks in terms of the issue areas that you're working on. Ian?
So I'm going to concentrate on internet governance in this context. And I think it is fair to say that what we've seen over the last year, and this mirrors some of the other areas that we've discussed, is Snowden has essentially exacerbated existing or possibly even latent trends that have were pre-existing but have been brought more closely to the surface and have been seriously complicated from a United States perspective by the leaks and the reaction to them. So the internet, of course, is a hugely complex system of systems that is already governed in a number of extremely complicated ways, and that governance has always involved government in it, but there are different philosophical and practical views about how that sort of government involvement should relate to the private sector and the civil society. And essentially, you can put governments into three buckets, if you like. It's a group of authoritarian countries who really want to exercise more control, largely because they fear what the internet can, what trouble the internet, or what trouble can come to them through the internet. Then you have the liberal democracies, including the United States, who have, as well as a sort of philosophical, a pragmatic view that most of the functions of running the internet should be left to the private sector. And then you have a third group of swing states who are not quite sure where they sit between those. And you might think of sort of Brazil and India in that bucket. They're attracted to sort of private sector models, but at the same time, the idea that the United States exercises too much control makes them a bit nervous about fully accepting this. And as Jim Lewis said in the last panel, in recent years, there has been concern that what exists at the moment doesn't really work. A sort of multi-stakeholder model that everybody has a say and it's done by consensus, which kind of works if you're developing code, but can that work on something that's so fundamental to the way in which governments work? And I think what Snowden has done has emboldened the first group of authoritarian states to believe that they can push back against the United States position for a more multi-stakeholder, more private sector, more civil society involved role. It has made the swing states, the Brazils, possibly not so much the Indias, but other swing states, less inclined to caucus with the United States and others. And possibly most importantly, it is undermined the ability of the United States to work with its natural allies, particularly in Europe, to organize itself against these roles. Now, against these other positions that I've just described. And I think that in some ways is the most worrying trend going forward. We have a number of international meetings over the next few years, most obviously a big ITU meeting happening in October, November. And you know, that will likely lead to the election of a Chinese Secretary General of the International Telecoms Union, an organization that sits within the UN, which some people would like to take on more responsibility for internet governance, and others, including the United States and some European countries, believe would stymie innovation and the ability to keep the internet as vibrant as it ought to be. And I think if Snowden's done anything, it has made it more difficult for the United States to exercise its influence over this process going forward. Now, it's not been a complete disaster. One hopeful sign in the last year has been the Net Mundial conference, called by the Brazilians to sort of say, we need to think differently about this, partly in reaction to their president's umbrage at being spied on in Snowden. And the US, I think, managed that quite, after an initially very ham-fisted response to the international aspects of this, actually performed quite well tactically in announcing that the United States wanted to find a way of giving up its oversight of ICANN's role in giving out names and numbers right before the conference, which shifted the focus of that conference. And they also gave enough space to ICANN, whose president, Fadi Chahidi-Dinka, did a fantastic job of getting his arm around Dilma Rousseff and persuading her that multilateralism was not the way forward, that really she wanted to be a non-American advocate for the multi-stakeholder approach. But there's still a long way to go, and unless the US can work well with its allies to overcome some of the counter views, then it's going to be an uphill slog.
Okay. Bruce?
Well, in a way, all I want to do is try to respond to some of the themes that came out in the last panel, and in a sense, picking up on what Ian just said, it seems to me that discussion you just described is a perfect microcosm of the broader phenomenon of where the United States is going to have to be in the international order. It seems to me that it matters to be clear about the context here, and some of this came up in the discussion in the last panel. This is not just any moment in American foreign policy. We are at a moment of inflection. We are at a moment of flux. I'm among those who think that the storyline of American decline has been exaggerated. We talked a little bit about this in the last panel. The storyline of the BRICS has also been exaggerated, both in the scale of their influence and the degree of their unity, et cetera. But there's no question that there's a redistribution of power that's ongoing. And I think the kind of overarching question that the United States faces is, to what extent is it going to be possible or feasible for the United States to continue to play the role it has historically played of being the kind of leading actor in shaping the contours of the international order, and where this redistribution of power will fit into that. And one way to think about it is, if you had in the Cold War, it was a fairly simple matrix where you had one set of powers on one side of the equation, the United States and its allies, versus Russia, the Soviet Union, and to a lesser extent its allies. That was one phenomenon. We've then been through a 25-year period where the United States was really the only power that could play at a global level in a kind of meaningful sense and a leading power. And during that 25 years, we've seen the articulation and the institutionalization of a very expansive and robust set of international agreements, sort of tools of international order to do all kinds of things, from internet to civil wars to free trade, et cetera, but all during a period of there was no real contest at the level of top powers. And we're entering a phase where there will be a contest among the top powers about the shape and the contour of that international order. And in my sense, and I think this is confirmed by a lot of what was said in the previous panel, is that we have to see as Snowden as not a discrete event, but one part of a process of weakening the United States precisely as it enters that moment of trying to retool the international order or reconfigure it for the current realities. And it seems to me that one way to think about this is, people talked about the moral high ground before. Well, what are the components of that? At least the myths, and they were always myths, they were never the full realities, but the myths of America were that it was a country that was willing to put at least some portion of its security into defense of allies. Right? It wasn't just a purely national security actor, it had an alliance structure. That was, I think, substantially eroded by both Iraq and the global war on terror and some of the issues that came out in the alliance issues there. Second myth is about, and these myths have important elements of truth, by the way. Second myth is about the United States as the bulwark of the global financial order, an open and stable international financial and trade order. That's very much true, but the global financial crisis queered a lot of people's perceptions about the credibility and the reliability of the United States as the guarantor of that order and as the steerer of that order. And then the third myth is about American civil liberties and the kind of model that the United States provides versus other powers, and Snowden has challenged that myth. And again, I'm using the word myth in a true sense. There's a lot of truth in myths. So you had a kind of a security image of the United States, a financial image of the United States, and a civil liberties image of the United States, all of which have been challenged in the last several years, and Snowden has been part of that, not alone. We've talked a bit about how this affects some of the countries, and you, I think, in your presentation on internet governance, characterized accurately the groupings of countries. One country we didn't talk about much is Russia. I do think that the fact of Snowden being given asylum in Russia, when it happened, was a part of the process of the breakdown of the reset, a breakdown of the trust between the United States and Russia. The fact that it happened in the lead up to the Olympics, and it was part of why the United States chose not to go to the Olympics, to the Russian Olympics at a senior level. All of these were kind of cascading effects that, I mean, by itself was not determinate, but certainly didn't help anything in the kind of breakdown that we've seen in US-Russia relations of late, and that is going to complicate very substantially all sorts of aspects of the international order. So I think that and the piece that I worry most about is actually these swing states that Ian talked about, and we heard about them before. The one piece that I thought I wanted to kind of highlight or dramatize from the Brazil and India portions is it seemed to me that one of the phenomena is that there is an active debate in these swing countries about to what extent to partner with the United States or not. And for those people who were most important in pushing the argument, it was never we should buddy up with the United States, it's that we have interests, they have interests, and by the way, our interests align a lot, so let's just get over our old hang-ups and our old anti-Americanism and et cetera, and actually recognize their interests align. Some of those people were the most embarrassed by the Snowden revelations about who was being targeted and how, and it's weakened them in that argument. I think that's recoverable, as is the Allies piece, but it weakened the United States in that argument at a critical moment in time. The silver lining in all of this, and I think again this is just building on themes we heard last year, is if you're somebody in Delhi or in Brazil or Germany and you're arguing, well, look, the United States has shown that it's not as strong as it claims it is on civil liberties. Are you going to then say, therefore, we should work more closely with China, that paragon of civil liberties, or Russia, that paragon of civil liberties? I mean, there's nowhere else to go, right? So in this question of whether or not the United States can recover a kind of leadership function, I think the United States profits, as a silver lining here, it profits from the character of its potential adversaries. That it's not as if China or Russia offer an alternative that's particularly attractive or particularly credible in the kinds of terms we're talking about.
Great. Cam?
Thanks, Peter. I do want to note that it's also the 25th anniversary of the crackdown at Tiananmen Square, just because I can. But a year ago, as the first stories about Snowden, the 215 story, the Prism program were breaking, I was occupying the Secretary's office at the Department of Commerce and sort of saw some of this the way you might watch an accident in sort of slow motion vision as just unfolding slowly and kind of powerless to change the outcomes. I think for me and others of us at the Department of Commerce who've been focused on internet governance, on privacy, on the importance of data flows to trade, I think the impact of the disclosures on our stakeholders overseas, on the gulf that people have talked about between American rhetoric and our actions. All of these things, I think, were apparent, but this was initially viewed, I think, as a security issue. And I think you would get no argument from the White House today that trotting the president out a week or two in to say, don't worry, no American citizens are being subject to surveillance, really helped to ignite the flames. And while some of the sort of official reactions, as Karl Theodor Rotenberg described, were sort of muted, there was a grassroots reaction that really led to a lot of the effects that people have already described. But the fallout on those effects on trade and commerce have been significant. I met this morning with a general counsel from a leading tech company who said, there's no question that this has had an impact on the willingness of foreign customers to trust American providers. And we see that playing out in various ways. I think most directly in China. Cisco attributed a downturn in results at the end of 2013 to the loss of some China business. IBM has lost contracts there. I mean, China has, as was described, taken sort of the equivalencies that it's able to claim here to increase the already difficult barriers to entry in that marketplace. The other place where, for all the reasons Karl Theodor described, the impacts have been greatest has been in Europe. It has put a real spotlight on American companies, heightened the distrust, the fear, the angst for Google that exists there, and translate it into political and policy terms. So because of the desire for a European cloud, Parliament actually voted to direct the European Commission to come up with a plan for a European internet that would keep the data on European citizens from leaving European borders. We have seen the efforts towards the European privacy regulation gain a lot of steam. And European institutions looking to be the instruments of leverage to keep data out of the hands of the NSA. So in the safe harbor context, the safe harbor agreement has enabled the flow of data across borders, notwithstanding some of the differences in our privacy systems. The European Commission has issued what Vivian Redding called her to-do list for the Federal Trade Commission and Department of Commerce to make changes to safe harbor, most of which are doable, but providing recourse for European citizens for U.S. surveillance and other law enforcement activity is beyond the powers of that agreement. We're also seeing in TTIP As Carl Theodore also described, this has been heightened as an issue. I think on both fronts, there's progress being made, but these issues will continue to play out. And I'll talk more sort of about where I see this going.
Bob?
Sure. I'm going to talk briefly about defense, and then I'm going to spend most of my time, based on where I sit today, talking about tech and industry from a global data center perspective. Within defense, I think in light of the Snowden revelations, I think Cam's explanation of a kind of an aircraft accident or a car accident kind of proceeding slowly holds true. There was a sense of awkwardness, and I think a lot of folks just watching to see how the United States was going to deal with it. At the same time, when these unfortunate situations happen, national security and defense dialogue trumps. So with coalition partners, close allies, the conversation continues, and it continues to grow. I think the other dimension is, you have two sides of a discussion. There's an above the table political discussion that's going on, and then there's a discussion within the defense and intelligence community. And again, from the substance of national interest, not only U.S. national interest, but foreign national interest, there is, we built alliances, coalitions, and relationships based on dialogue. So from a defense perspective, I think that is a trend that we've seen, and I think will continue to play out over time. It does get altered, based on other events, right? So we're now in the process of looking at a dialogue that's ongoing with these Chinese indictments from DOJ. We talk about moral leadership and what that means. That's a broader discussion than just defense, but how that plays out vis-a-vis something like what was announced yesterday with the Game Over Zeus botnet takedown and the Department of Justice's U.S. leadership in terms of taking down a global threat. So those all interplay as we get into this discussion, and I'm happy to talk about where that might lead us in the Q&A. In looking at the tech industry and just picking up on Cam's points, because I do spend a lot of energy here with regards to looking at this. In my role as a chief security officer at I/O, we have global operations in Singapore and building out in London and around the world. When we look at what we're driving at, where business, tech industry is going, a significant amount of projections that U.S. business has made, it has been predicated on growing global business, growing business offshore. And there is concern based on what has happened with the Snowden issues. Just common estimates in the world of cloud computing, right? We had projected, most industry projections, Gartner's projections are about a 40% compounded annual growth out through just 2015 in cloud computing. What is the impact then over time of what is happening here with the Snowden discussion? When you look at the surveys, and this surveys almost every couple of weeks, pulsing foreign companies, U.S. companies, foreign governments, U.S. governments in this space, the issues that continue to come up are data sovereignty and data custody. And Stu and others can talk about it from a legal perspective. I'll talk about it from an industry and business intelligence and policy perspective here. There is concern, and the concern is, where is the data? Who owns the data? Who controls the data? We are beginning, as we survey from industry to government and getting government responses back in the foreign arena, there is concern about what that's going to do in terms of buying behavior, due diligence processes in the RFP process, concerns about training with regards to data protection laws, and who's doing what in that space. So there's a lot of things going on here as we kind of unpack the issue of Snowden revelations. But we are challenged in that space as we kind of go through that, because I think, like government, industry was caught off guard in terms of what was happening here. So spending a bit more time with regards to government affairs, people being engaged in this space and looking at it not only from their engagement with U.S. government affairs, but foreign government affairs, a lot of listening going on in terms of not only attitudes regarding the revelations, but the implications. So all of the laws that are being talked about, whether it's US, Canadian, Brazilian, and the discussions, there's a lot of attention inside of the strategy groups at different corporations, as well as in the boardrooms. Certainly with our company at IO, we spend time discussing these types of issues in the board and investors are concerned. You know, what are the long-term implications? I think the other point I would make in this space is that as we see this playing out, you do have kind of several different types of reactions coming from industry. You've seen Google come out pretty strong. You've seen, Cam mentioned Cisco's announcement. But most have been very quiet, right? They're thinking through this and trying to sort out what the implications are. And that's both from a technological perspective as well as a business perspective and what I would say a government affairs engagement perspective. The immediate impact as I've seen it, as I work in the data center and cloud computing world and kind of looking at supporting critical infrastructure enterprise, both US and abroad, is especially in a couple of different regions, the APAC region as well as in the GCC states, there's pause on RFPs, on requests for proposals. You know, where we had projected award of activities, the Snowden revelations is a contributing factor in just slowing things down a bit. So let me stop there and then I'll talk about projections and trends in the future.
Let me introduce our final panelist, Stuart Baker, who's a partner with Steptoe & Johnson, where he returned to after 3.5 years as Department of Homeland Security's first Assistant Secretary for Policy, and he has a long career working technology, intelligence policy issues, law, where these all come together. So, Stuart.
Thanks. I think the request was I think about what this meant for intelligence overall. You know, it's always hard to tell how bad a particular leak is for your intelligence sources and methods. It often depends on knowing a lot of classified information and knowing who responded in very particular ways to the leaks. So it's very difficult to say, I know we lost this capability, although there are so many disclosures that are so specific. This target, the Taliban, targeted in this way with this kind of tool, that it's impossible to believe that some of our targets didn't read their names in the paper and decide to change their methods of communication. So we've lost that. We've certainly lost big time in the relationships on which most of our intelligence operations, at least our signals intelligence operations, depend, which is allies who are prepared to help us with geography or other capabilities, and companies that are willing or feel obliged to cooperate with the government passively or actively. On the diplomatic side with governments, I think many of these things are repairable. I mean, it doesn't help to have the Swedish government called out for cooperating with the US government against Russia, or the Norwegian government called out for exactly the same kind of a relationship. But in the end, those relationships are built on mutual self-interest, and they will continue pretty much as you said. Companies, it's going to be much harder. They recognize that they're in a power relationship that is unbalanced when they talk to the United States government. They're very angry. They probably overestimate the ultimate commercial fallout from this, but that's easy to say when it's not your quarterly revenue targets that are getting missed. And so they are very angry. They are responding in ways that are not completely rational. I'm not sure it helps to rage against the United States as a privacy invader if you're ultimately selling U.S. technology to the rest of the world. And that probably accounts for some of the silence. But there is no doubt, I mean, I get this from clients all the time now. They want to know, do I have to? What's the least I can do? How can I challenge this? What happens? Often when rather than if there's a disclosure about this. These are questions I used to feel obliged to say to my clients, you know, look, this is quite possibly going to get leaked, and you need to think about that as well. And you need to realize, you know, the agencies are your friends, but they're their own friends first. All of those things I used to have to say, I don't have to say anymore. They come in knowing it. And that is going to hurt the U.S. intelligence enterprise in significant ways, but ways that are hard to identify specifically. Interestingly, the Snowdenista journalists have felt we don't want to disclose names. They carefully smudge faces, but the names of companies, no, they deserve to have pain. And so there's a glee with which the names of companies are disclosed, even where there isn't really good evidence that the companies did anything particularly to help the U.S. government. The Snowdenistas have even withheld the names of targets of U.S. intelligence who are encouraging jihad against the United States, because that would invade their privacy, at the same time that they are disclosing the names of all the companies that responded when their country called and asked them to do something. So the expectation that there will be pain associated from working with the U.S. government is at an all-time high. The other intel diplomacy issues that we've sort of heard about already, data sovereignty is not just bad for business, it's terrible for intelligence because, and indeed, that's exactly why it's being pushed. It is something that if you are a Brazilian or German intelligence agency, you want that data stored in Brazil or Germany, not just to protect the privacy of your citizens, but so that you can invade it at will. And indeed, so that you can keep the United States from invading it or have something to trade when the time comes for the brutally reciprocal relationship that is intelligence cooperation. Therefore, there's a kind of unholy alliance between the privacy groups and the security ministries of many of these countries, both of whom have an interest in bringing that data to their country. Interestingly, there's a major privacy issue for Americans which no one wants to talk about, which is that the Germans, without a court order, without anything, without any requirement for a gag order, are going to go into German providers and just ask them if they're willing to volunteer information about Americans. And of course, the providers are going to say, yes, sir. And I don't need any paper, thanks. All the things that people assume the U.S. won't do, they can assume that even the Germans will do. And so if your data ends up stored there, which it could easily, you are in deep trouble. Last thought on this, there's a risk aversion crater where the National Security Agency used to be now. We're going to see a decade of reluctance to be creative, reluctance to be aggressive, or scrutinizing every collection possibility through a lens that says, well, I can, but would some president sometimes say I shouldn't? Or if it leaks, how will it look? And that is not good for intelligence. The CIA has been through 5 risk aversion episodes in the last 40 years. But NSA is making up for all of the ones that it missed. And so I think we will lose intelligence capabilities that we won't even know we've lost until we send troops someplace and they end up deeply surprised and hurt in ways that we're not used to having our troops hurt. last question, is there anything good about this? I guess there is an element of, well, I noticed this when I was at NSA, that our targets went from thinking they couldn't possibly to, I can't help it, I'm totally hosed. There's a kind of capitulation, to use a market term, where people go from they want to believe first they can't be targeted, then they say, oh, I'm targeted, I have to do a bunch of stuff, and they start doing this stuff, and then at some point you hope they say, I did all that stuff and it didn't work, I give up, I'm just going to have to recognize that they're listening to me. And I think there's an element of that in this. There are a lot of people who are now of the view that they just can't keep the United States from finding out what they think. And maybe there's a little bit of a payoff in that, a desensitization. All of the things, you know, I've learned this from watching really good politicians. There's a point at which you can say, oh, that's old news. And now many of the scandals that otherwise would have turned up in the next 15 years, we'll be able to say, oh, that's old news. Didn't you read Glenn Greenwald's book? And so maybe that takes the edge off future disputes, because people now have a pretty good idea of what our targets are, how we do it, and the extent to which other, even allies, can be targets. Pretty cold comfort, but there's a little something there.
Great. So I'm going to pose the next question, but ask the panel to give us a shorter, quicker response, because we've got more people and less time. Yeah. So essentially, what do you see as the long-term legacy of this? What are the issues that are going to play out in your area in the year, the 5 years, the 10 years ahead, and how might we navigate the negative side of that? Ian?
So I think in the internet governance side, it's not entirely clear how it'll play out, but one of the key factors will be the extent to which the United States can marshal its allies, both governments and in the private sector. And I'm a little bit more concerned about that than I might have been a few months ago, given the continuing European concern and the transatlantic sort of divide on these issues. Given, I think, President or the administration's reaction was quite poor to start with, but the President gave an opportunity for the Europeans to climb down the ladder that they climbed up, and they don't really seem to have taken it. It's not clear where they go next, and therefore how you close that gap. And as that relates to internet governance, these are the people that the United States needs to be working with in order to bring alongside the swing states and to build a sort of bulwark to a fairly significant group of countries, not just sort of authoritarian states, but fragile democracies who are now even more concerned about the idea that people from outside can cause them trouble through this thing called the internet. Where will this play out? I think there's sort of international meetings. There's an ITU plenipotentiary meeting in Korea in October, November, and we'll get that could involve unless action is taken, we could have a new telecommunications treaty, which, although in itself doesn't mean much, could change subtly the way in which telecommunications, which has an impact on the internet. There will be an ICANN process to work out how the US moves away, and how that plays forward will be an indicator. There will be issues of the extent to which new governance regimes impact on how authoritarian states take legitimization for the way in which they impinge on the internet freedom of their own people, and I think that's something that's relevant here. And probably fourth and most significantly is this idea of internet fragmentation, which is an overblown concept that to a large extent the private sector runs and operates the internet, and it will root around problems. But the internet, like any other internet, is more valuable the more nodes that are connected to it. And if countries are able to close themselves off from the internet under and have authority from international organizations, perceived authority from international organizations to do this, then not only are they ultimately the losers, but the rest of the people left on the network also get less benefit, and that has an economic as well as a social implication. Where do we go from here? I think working with other states, trying to create evidence for a common interest in working together is important. But I also think getting the US private sector, despite their angst, to work with private sectors overseas in places like India and Brazil and particularly Europe to sort of persuade them that they need to talk to their governments and work together is going to be ultimately the way that we work through this.
Great. Bruce?
Well, having been fairly gloomy in my first response, let me be slightly more upbeat in this, because if I look out over several years, and even in the shorter term, that I'm more inclined to your last point about there's an old news phenomenon now, or at least there can be. It's well timed. There are about to be Brazilian elections, and there just have been Indian elections. When you look at the swing states and some of the other actors who are in this, they're not U.S. allies, but they're not adversaries. They're kind of neither friend nor foe country. I think you've seen relatively quickly now a sense of, look, it's just too costly to sustain tension with the United States, so let's find ways to move past this. And elections are helpful, either by bringing new actors or by sort of demarcating. We can say, well, that was that phase, and now we'll move on. Harold talked about that in the Brazilian context. I think we'll see that in the Indian context, a sense of, okay, that was that. Let's move onwards. And I think the kind of used phrase, mutual self-interest, that when you look at these actors and what they're looking at in big picture terms with China, with Russia, with the fraying of different regimes, and they look at the United States, the mutual self-interest is pretty rapidly putting this one back in a box at the geostrategic level, at least.
Yeah. So about 3 months into this, I reminded people that a foreigner, Alexis de Tocqueville, said that the greatness of America lies not in her being more enlightened than any other country, but in her ability to repair her faults. And I think we have seen that at work over the past year. The first, I went to a cabinet meeting to talk about privacy issues. It was clear then that I was the only person in the room who had really devoted a substantial time to thinking about those. Over the past year, that has certainly changed. The president, John Podesta, members of the cabinet have spent an extraordinary amount of time thinking about these issues. We have as the product the president's declaration in January that we're going to extend protections to foreign citizens. The decision that Ian alluded to internationalize ICANN and the number assignment functions that it performs. There's more to be done. We need to, implement a lot of those steps. I think more can be done to delineate limits on the use of some of the tools that we have. For example, encryption standards and fooling with those, or exploiting vulnerabilities in systems. All have helped and will help to regain the moral high ground, both in terms of aligning and being clear about what we regard as, if you will, moral surveillance. Being clear about what surveillance we do and why and on what basis. That's something that was lacking. I think also it turns the tables a little bit as other countries that all acknowledge that they do the same face questions. All right, what do you do? What do you do? What protections do you give to your own citizens, much less to the citizens of foreign countries? And I think all of this has helped to emphasize that privacy is part of American values, that Americans do care about it, notwithstanding perceptions overseas. Carl Theodore's successor, Thomas de Maizière, met with American companies here a few weeks ago, went back to Germany and said, it's clear to me that American internet companies care about privacy. So getting that message across has been important. I think enacting legislation to fill some of the gaps in our system would help. But the other piece is engagement. It's going to take continued leadership on the part of the United States, on the part of the American president and other high leaders to articulate our values in this area, to articulate why the model of internet governance that was spawned here and that we have supported is important. Carl Theodor talked about data secessionism. I like that term. Maybe we need to sort of, data Abraham Lincoln to sort of stand up for what's important about this. At the end of the day, I agree with other speakers that this is going to come down to economic and other self-interest. But that it is in the self-interest of Europe, in support of its economic growth, of its trade relationships, in the support of other countries that want access to the world economy, to support these values. It's complicated, because the mechanisms that we have are not strong enough. But as Churchill, I think he once said about democracy, it's maybe the worst system aside from every other one, and I think that applies to the system of internet governance that we have.
Great. Bob? Yeah, from a U.S. industry and kind of global industry perspective, I think there's three trends that we need to keep track of. One is encryption. Cam mentioned it. Bulk encryption in terms of how we're taking care of data is going to become increasingly important. We hit an inflection point with the RSA breach. I think we're hitting another point here as industry moves forward in this space in light of the Snowden revelations. Who has the keys, right? That's a really important issue. The second is, and again, I think others refer to this, is custody, data custody assurance. How we do that, we see the beginnings of that. The Electronic Frontier Foundation has put out surveys. You watch companies like Google putting out transparency reports. I don't think we're going to be able to continue with the service level agreements and contractual language that we have today over time, especially as more and more of this gets reviewed. And I think that's something that begins to balance the transparency and the security discussion, the encryption, of course, being part of that security discussion, the custody assurance being part of the transparency discussion. The third area is regionalization. I think we're definitely going to be moving into that space, and how companies, not just tech companies, but companies writ large within the United States and globally deal with that is going to be an important thing to look at. I would say we're going to see more U.S. foreign partner relationships. I mean, you saw that with Microsoft recently announcing the migration of the Azure cloud using a channel partner, 21 Vianet, to help them with business in China. Now, that wasn't completely driven by Snowden revelations. It was driven by a long-standing discussion internal to the company about doing business in China. But I think those kinds of relationships begin to evolve. I think another second-order question then becomes, as you begin to look at positioning yourself differently through regionalization and some of these other things that I've talked about. Now you're in a space of changing your business continuity plans. Not only business continuity as you deal with it from a client perspective, but also from the standpoint of your own internal workings. And so I think those all get rolled into a discussion. Extended supply chain comes in. Your extended enterprise is going to begin to change a bit in light of this. So I think there's a series of discussions, some of them already taking place, some still to take place. And I would agree with Ian and others, it really will be impacted by what the public sector, what the governments say and what they don't say But I would agree that the private sector has been, but will continue to be much more engaged in this discussion because it is about business.
So looking out a ways, I think obviously this is just pushes people in the direction they were already moving, and the only really troublesome thing, if you look 5 years or 8 years out, the only relationship I think is troublesome is with Europe, because this issue has allowed the Europeans to take their data protection assumptions to a new level, and their enthusiasm for squeezing the U.S. on that issue to a new level, and it's going to cause real pain to important national security interests. It is in Brussels' nature to twist the United States' tail. Confrontation with the United States improves their turf, improves their prestige, and gives them ideas for things that they can be proposing internally in Europe. So there's always going to be tension. The tension only ends when we make it absolutely clear that they've gone across a red line for us. And so far, we have not done that. We have not said, you know, if you keep this up, maybe we really don't need a TTIP, because frankly, I don't think we do. And if it's not going to address this process of holding industry segment after industry segment hostage to get changes in U.S. government policy, which is something that's been going on since about 2004. I think if we can't resolve that in TTIP, I don't think we're resolving our principal trade barriers with Europe. So we really need to indicate that this is causing us to rethink what had been automatic support for closer European unity and unification, and a reluctance. I mean, we tried to walk Cameron back from raising questions about the relationship that the United Kingdom has with Europe. I think we should not be doing stuff like that if Europe is going to be pressing us on issues that have such an impact on our national security. Whether that leads to a breach or a final sobering up in Europe about this issue, I can't tell, but my money's on sober.
We've got time for a couple of questions, so same rules as before. Please raise your hand, wait for the mic, and introduce yourself. Right over there, yes.
Libo Liu with the Voice of America. Several of you mentioned that China has cut business with or reduced the contracting opportunity for several U.S. giant tech companies. I'm wondering do you think it's going to be just isolated sanctions against these U.S. companies such as Google, Apple, or do you think this might develop into a wide range of a trade war with the United States? Thank you.
So I think that's an open question. I think typically in the U.S.-China relationship, there's a very reciprocal reaction. So the United States does something that China doesn't like. It engenders a response, some form of retaliation, and then things tend to move on. I'm hopeful that will be the case here, but this is wrapped up in a number of other things that could continue that could cause it to continue. And sort of issues of the overall U.S.-China relationship today, a set of protectionist policies as well, responses to the recent indictments. So all of those, I think, could sort of exacerbate this particular issue.
I might disagree a little with Cam. We could do much more to China, and they would kick us out of their tech sector as fast as they could. We could do nothing to China, and they would kick us out of their tech sector as fast as they could. This is overdetermined. They have an industrial policy reason and a security reason to try to move up that value chain and to displace as many U.S. companies as they can, and they have a shot at doing it. They are doing it in some areas. And they're going to push that as fast as their market and their customers, especially their sophisticated customers, are willing to be pushed. And I'm not sure that what we do here has as much impact. They will try to sell it as this is a retaliation for the last thing you did, which you need to roll back. But they're doing it as fast as they can do it, consistent with keeping their economy on track.
Okay, just building on the points, I agree with both Cam and with Stu. I think there's a political interplay, but there's a supply and demand and tech readiness piece. And as you look at readiness of companies in China, they're rapidly approaching tech readiness in many different dimensions of what the U.S. is doing, but there are certain key areas that as we kind of go forward, especially in the area of operational efficiency, that we have an opportunity to take advantage of. I'm not sure how well organized we are to take advantage of it, but I do agree it's fleeting.
Okay, let's get one last question right there.
Steve Wonders, local researcher. As I heard from former German ambassador to the U.S., Ischinger, this morning, court case, the Germans are taking the U.S. to court to try and hold the U.S. legally responsible for the spying on Ms. Merkel's phone. This seems pretty extreme. Any reactions to this from the panel?
I'll let the lawyers handle that.
Anyone want to handle it? We got a lawyer right here, so go ahead.
Yeah, the last time I saw it, unless this is very recent, the prosecutor said I don't have enough evidence to charge anybody in particular, which sounds like the right outcome. But yeah, I don't know who you sue for that, or who your witnesses are.
Bruce?
I was just going to say, I thought it was probably politically helpful, the recent revelation, and I can't remember who revealed this revelation, whether it was us or them, but the revelation that the Israelis had tapped Bill Clinton's phone. That's probably fairly useful to kind of highlight. It's like allies do this too. Well,
the Germans gave us a list of 300 targets that they were working on, and 30 of them were Americans.
Right, so there we go.
You know, nobody's hands are clean on this. So maybe, yeah, we should threaten counterclaims.
Okay. Well, we'll leave that court case or court cases to play out in the next couple of years.
I'll pass out my card. Okay?
Yeah. But I want to thank not only this panel, but the prior panelists for joining us for this discussion, as well as all of you for coming out. And you've got the hashtag up there for the conversation to continue. And I think the one thing takeaway is that it will continue in whatever shape or form. So thank you again.
Great.